figured out here. Okay. So we're in lecture 8. Today we're going to start talking about how our climate changes and how we know Earth's climate has varied in the past. And that's going to involve using some of the really interesting records that are available to us from our planet. So this is an image from an earlier IPCC report. So this is from the 4th assessment report, so in the mid-2000s. And I want you to take a moment and look at the data. And this is a data set that's coming from ice cores. So we're going to talk about ice cores today, but it's basically an archive, a record of atmospheric air. Tell me what you see, what this data is telling us. So I'll give you about a minute and a half for you to type up your thoughts here. Okay, so what are we seeing? What is this data showing us? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. So these data sets are showing us, first thing we always want to look for is what is the x-axis on these figures? The x-axis is showing us time, and it says before 2005. So 0 is 2005. 5,000 is 5,000 years before 2005. 20,000 is 20,000 years before 2005. So 20,000 years ago. And that's the same for all of our 4 panels. The top is showing us the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The bottom is showing methane in the atmosphere, and the top right is nitrous oxide. All 3 of these are greenhouse gases. And as mentioned by pretty much all of you, the most obvious thing is that last spike right at the end. That last spike is industrialization starting in like the 1700s, 1800s. And the unprecedented change in all of those greenhouse gases. Now, how do we know that those numbers from 20,000 years ago? Well, we're going to talk about that today in terms of our ice core records, how ice cores and other different proxies can let us know what the past was like. All right. So has our climate always been the same? Well, no. Okay. And we know that. And it's not that we're arguing today that climate change is unprecedented. No, we know that the climate changes. It's not the fact that the climate is changing. We know the climate has changed in the past. What is different today is this spike, the rate, the unprecedented pace, the rate of change. The Earth has never seen a change so fast. That is what is troubling. Okay? Our Earth has changed in the past. Our climate has changed in the past. So we're talking about how and why it's changed. We'll talk about the timescales over which natural change can occur. We'll talk about our proxy records, and we will talk about how oxygen isotopes can be used from ice cores to help us infer past temperature. So what are our controls on our planetary temperature? So going back a few weeks, we think about what controls a planet's temperature. Well, those are things like the amount of energy received by the planet, how much energy gets reflected, how much energy is absorbed in terms of outgoing energy via a greenhouse effect or via an atmosphere, and also in changes to the internal components of a climate system. So things like feedback loops and where the continents are, how the ocean and atmosphere are circulating. So we'll talk about how our climate can change with each one of these points. So how our climate can change? Well, we can change the amount or distribution of incoming shortwave radiation. Remember, shortwave radiation is the energy coming in from the sun, that higher frequency wavelength, or excuse me, higher frequency, shorter wavelength radiation. How can you change that? Well, you can change the solar luminosity, which you saw in the first homework, has changed, but not a lot in terms of the last few hundred years. We can also change Earth's orbit to impact how much of the incoming energy or sunlight Earth receives. Okay, so variations in the solar output have increased on billion-year timescales. And solar luminosity can also change on shorter timescales, those sunspot cycles, which you saw in your first homework. They're not well understood in terms of why they happen, but when there's more sunspots, the increase in solar luminosity or solar output is a little bit higher and can be measured. We can see a slight increase in planetary temperature, but we understand we can add that to our climate models that every 11 years we're going to see a slight increase. But overall, this is not changing our climate right now. This is something that happens on very long timescales, which we saw in our first homework, that over billions of years, changes in the sun's luminosity will impact Earth's temperature. The other way we can change the amount of incoming sunlight Earth receives is by changing our orbit. Now, Earth's orbit around the sun is slightly elliptical, but it can change from being elliptical to more circular. And this is a very exaggerated diagram here, but go from more circular to more elliptical, and it goes back and forth between this extreme, either circular or eccentric, roughly every 100,000 years. Now, why this matters, right, is this would change how much energy each latitude, each hemisphere receives throughout the year, because now at different points of the year, we're either closer or further away to the sun. So it would make our seasons more extreme or less extreme. But that happens on 100,000 year cycles. And so these Milankovitch cycles, there's three parts. The first one is the eccentricity. It happens every 100,000 years. The second way you could change the orbit or the mechanics of the Earth's processes is obliquity. And obliquity is how tilted the axis is. So right now, Earth's axis is tilted at about 23.5 degrees from due north, or from 0 degrees. but it can become more tilted. We have evidence from records on Earth, our proxy records and our paleo records, that Earth's tilt was more like 24.5 degrees. It's also been less. It can go as low as 21.1 degrees. So more tilted, less tilted. That's obliquity. And this change in tilt, going from very tilted to less tilted and back to very tilted, happens roughly every 41,000 years. So thinking about what the tilt does for our seasons right now, what would an increased tilt do or higher obliquity do to our seasons on our Earth? All right. So remembering what the tilt does to begin with is it makes our seasons have seasons, right? The idea is that we are going to see periods around the year where we're either tilted away or towards the sun in each hemisphere. So when you increase the obliquity or increase the tilt, it will make the seasons more extreme. Okay, so it would be A. You'd have warmer summers because there's going to be more latitudes in each hemisphere pointed towards the sun, and then colder winters, more latitudes in that hemisphere pointed away. So our Arctic Circle, which is now at 66.3 or 7, which is based on that tilt, would become lower. Okay, so more extreme, so A. The next part of the Milankovitch cycles is the precession. And so this actually is the positioning of our axis. Okay, so right now, our axis is tilted away from the sun in January. So that's our northern hemispheric winter. And in July of our orbit, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. But what precession does is our axis is actually kind of wobbly. And so every 20,000, 23,000 years, the axis flips. And so that changes where in our orbit the hemisphere is facing the sun and also how close we are. So remember, there is a difference in our orbit in terms of distance, somewhat. Okay, so the precession is this idea that the Earth is kind of wobbling. And sometimes in history, we're pointed to Vega, star of Vega, or to Polaris. Now, I have a video here that helps visualize this wobble. Here is our wobble. Okay, so we're wobbling. Now we're on an extreme, and then we're going to wobble, and we're going to come back. Okay, and so Earth is doing this wobble every 23,000 years, going from tilted to the left, right, and back to the left. So that's called precession. Now, with precession in 11,000 years kind of from today, the northern hemispheric summer would occur in what we consider January of our calendar year. Okay, you're just flipping that axis tilt, but we're now closer to the sun, the northern hemisphere, the whole Earth during that time. And in the opposite, our winter would occur in July. We're tilted away from the sun, and now we're further from the sun. Okay, so here is today on top, and 11,000 years ago or 11,000 years into the future. You can think of it either way. The impact of precession. So what would northern hemispheric seasons have been like 11,000 years ago as compared to today? Okay, so the thing we have to think about here is not so much date, calendar date, but tilt, right? So when I say season, I'm referring to whether or not the northern hemisphere is tilted towards or away. So in the top panel here, January, yes, that's when we're in winter. But what matters here is not January, is that northern hemisphere is tilted away. Okay, so northern hemisphere is tilted away, so we're in northern hemispheric winter. But we are closer to the sun. An 11,000 years ago situation, the northern hemisphere is now tilted towards the sun in this position. So this is northern hemispheric summer when we're closer to the sun. So this would mean the northern hemispheric summers would be warmer. And then the opposite is true here. Now we're in winter in July and further away. So it's flipping the time of the seasons, but the time is not as important. What's important is where, how close or how far that seasonal switch is occurring in the orbit. Okay, so it would make the northern hemispheric winter colder and the northern hemispheric summer warmer. So extremes. And we just saw that with the obliquity, that makes things more extreme too. All right. Now, if you take the least common denominator of these orbits or these changes, they align together roughly every 100,000 years. So roughly every 100,000 years, we get an extreme in the eccentricity, an extreme in the obliquity, and an extreme flip in the precession, which leads to extremes in the amount of heat the northern hemisphere receives. And we'll explain why the northern hemisphere is so much more important than the southern hemisphere in a moment. But every 100,000 years, these align. Now, how would you respond to someone who says the current climate changes we are seeing today are due to Earth's orbit only, or exclusively because of Earth's orbit? What would you say to them? What's the time frame? Milankovitch cycles, the orbital changes are 100,000 years. Right. The orbit of Earth, we know it changes. In fact, we include that in our climate models, but it's over 100,000 years. We're talking today, 100 to 200 years, which is a fraction of that big Milankovitch cycle. Okay, so a well-known climate scientist, atmospheric scientist, Richard Alley, has testified before Congress many times. And he always, this is older, so some of these representatives are fortunately, thankfully, no longer in office. And he explains really well why the Milankovitch cycles are not important for today's climate change. So let's listen to him for a few minutes.
All due respect, you didn't answer the chairman's question. You know, the question was a very good question. There have been these back and forth between on glaciers and the melting that we've seen over and over again. Why did it happen then if these same factors that you're blaming it on didn't exist then?
I can give you as much or as little answer as that you would like.
Give me 15 seconds.
Okay, give me 30 if I may.
Okay,
the ice ages are caused by features of Earth's orbit. Your brightness is the sun. This is the Earth.
Right.
This is the equator. Here is the North Pole.
Yes.
If the North Pole stood straight up, you
Right.
could never give me a sunburn on my bald spot. But in fact, as you know, it is tipped over a little bit, and it nods a little more and a little less over 41,000 years. Now, when it nods more,
Right.
my bald spot ice melts, and the
Right.
Equator is a little more shaded, and now the ice grows, and now the ice melts. But it takes 41,000 years for this change to happen. We know what that's doing right now, and it's not fast enough to explain what we're seeing.
Tell me all of the other melts and backs and forth took all those thousands of years. There wasn't a situation where on Mount Kilimanjaro you had it 10 years you had this much ice, and then the next year you didn't, and vice versa.
Kilimanjaro, the records are fairly short. It would be not the best one to lean on, unfortunately. You know, what you do with glaciers, and I hoped I had made that point, is that one glacier can do interesting things. The world's glaciers tend to listen to the climate, and so you need to take a large data set of glaciers to know what's going on.
The whole point
What
is,
you then do find is that
we all know that these things happen. The major question of this whole debate today, and I'm very grateful to the chairman for bringing this and having an honest exchange of ideas, is what role mankind is playing, and thus if mankind is playing a minor role, how does that then justify some of the what we consider to be draconian solutions in controlling human behavior that has been offered to us by people who are espousing this particular theory? Mr. Sander, let me.
Okay. Anyway, didn't necessarily give Professor Alley all that much time to respond without interjection. Anyway, he used to be the Congress person representative for Costa Mesa and Huntington Beach. So that just is interesting. So why it matters in the Northern Hemisphere is because the Northern Hemisphere has that sea ice that grows and shrinks so much. Okay, and so more brightness, less brightness will impact that area. And we talked about the Arctic amplification, right? The Arctic can change so quickly because of that localized albedo effect. So then moving on to the next way our climate changing is we can change the amount of shortwave radiation reflected, right? So that's going to be changing our albedo, Earth's albedo, and we can also change the aerosols in our atmosphere. So we talked last class about large volcanic eruptions putting quite a bit of volcanic ash, reflective volcanic ash, and that is going to impact the amount of energy that Earth reflects. Okay, so these can be longer term, shorter term, but a lot of these things may combine together to impact climate on longer time periods. Okay, so today, thinking about our surface characteristics, right? Which surface has a higher albedo? And this is a surface area in Greenland. Okay. So yeah, in Greenland, right, when we have these surface melting features, the darker surface, B, will have a lower albedo. A is higher, but then that lower albedo melt will cause more melting around it. And so this is how, even on short time periods, surface characteristics can change. Okay? Now, if we move forward and our sea level rises because we've melted large amounts of land ice, and it floods large areas of land, what is this going to do to albedo and global temperatures? Alrighty. So yes, when you flood areas of land, ocean water is quite dark and it will decrease the albedo pretty much regardless of what it's flooding, and temperature will increase. Okay, so this is happening today, but if we think about in the past, right, where Earth's climate was warmer, there was less land ice, you could see how these feedbacks would play out in changing the climate naturally. These are natural feedbacks. You know, albedo can change naturally without humans, but obviously humans are impacting the albedo today. Okay, so for example, this is an article unfortunately the link was broken when I tried it recently, but it shows that, you know, there's parts of Antarctica that used to be covered with ice that are now moss covered, which moss, this dark green, is definitely darker, less reflective than what used to be there. The third way we can change our climate is by changing the amount of outgoing infrared or long wave radiation that gets trapped by our atmosphere. And that could be caused by things like soot from fires, wildfires, naturally occurring wildfires, you know, on Earth the Earth has always been on fire, and that can impact our greenhouse effect and also changes in the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. But we saw that the ocean has a really important buffering effect on atmospheric carbon. So changes in the temperature of the ocean can impact the amount of atmospheric carbon. So greenhouse gases can change naturally, but of course today humans are rapidly accelerating the concentrations of many of those gases. So thinking about some activities we've talked about, right? We talked just recently about the carbon cycle. Can you give me an activity or an event in the Earth system that can impact greenhouse gas concentrations on a million-year timescale? What is something that can impact greenhouse gases on million-year timescales? And what is something that changes greenhouse gases shorter, like say decades or maybe over the course of 100 years? Yeah. Okay, so deforestation, right? So deforestation is something that's happening on short time scales, okay, over the course of decades, 100 years. Okay, so this could be deforestation. What else did we talk about in class on Tuesday that impacts the amount of CO2, but it takes a long time? What was that process that we talked about? It's got magma and ash. Yeah. Okay, volcanic eruptions. Okay, so on naturally long time frames, we're talking volcanic eruptions, deforestation, and then we got fossil fuels. Okay, fossil fuels can go in both of these actually, because fossil fuels, the formation of fossil fuels can actually reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Yeah, the carbonate silicate cycle. Okay, so I have that written out here. On million-year timescales, volcanic activity, the formation of fossil fuels, creating carbonate rocks, those are processes the Earth has in it, these feedbacks, these cycles that can change the greenhouse gas concentrations. Humans aren't involved in any of that, right? That's just going on. Shorter timescales, we can change vegetation and soils. That could be deforestation, the amount of carbon that can be dissolved in the ocean because of temperature changes, humans' use and burning of fossil fuels. And these act to amplify the other changes that we've talked about. So you increase a little bit of CO2 and methane, and it will amplify some of the other effects. So all of these are working together to change our climate. Great. And the last one is internal changes to the Earth system. For example, changing where the continents are. Okay, we talked about this idea that the continents have drifted over time to where they are. We have our plate boundaries now, which is responsible for earthquakes and volcanism. But if the continents were all together 225 million years ago as Pangea, which we know to be true, then the atmosphere and ocean circulation was much more different, or much more different, much different. How would I say that? It was different, okay? Than today, which we know the ocean and atmosphere are moving heat and lack of heat or cold around. And so that would impact our climate. Also will impact our albedo. And these are all like internal feedbacks. So these are acting again on very long time scales. So our feedback, some of the ones we've talked about, right, are the ice albedo feedback, the permafrost carbon feedback. We melt or thaw, permafrost. That's going to impact the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, whether it's methane or carbon dioxide. Water vapor and clouds. There will be more evaporation in a warmer planet, more water vapor, potentially more clouds. Chemical weathering, right? That actually reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Then we also have the atmosphere-biosphere interaction. This idea, this reality that some plants do better in higher levels of CO2, okay? This is not going to save us, though. There's not enough plants that do this, but plants do better in some situations with higher CO2. So these are all our either positive amplifying feedbacks or our negative stabilizing feedbacks. Okay, just to reiterate, because this one is so important, it's happening literally before our eyes, is the ice albedo feedback mechanism a positive or negative feedback loop? All right. So with the ice albedo feedback, if our ice melts, okay, increase in ice melting, that's going to lead to a decrease in albedo, which means less energy from the sun is reflected, more gets absorbed, which means more ice will melt. This is a positive feedback, right? It amplifies. You start with a little bit of a ice melt, then you end up with more ice melt, and then it continues. Positive feedback. Okay, so this one is our water vapor, right? If the atmospheric temperature increases, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere will increase. The amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, remember, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. That will impact the amount of outgoing long wave radiation absorbed. So the greenhouse effect increases, which will increase temperature. Another positive feedback. Okay, and so these are just built in to our planet. These are built-in systems, feedbacks. So the only way for us to change that, to stop this amplification, is to start somewhere. And we can start by changing the temperature. How do we change the temperature? Well, we can stop emitting fossil fuels, which are increasing our planetary temperature because of that greenhouse effect. Okay, so why and how our climate changes, all of those we just went through are listed here. Keeping in mind, aerosols are in both categories. They can actually be, they can reflect energy or they can absorb energy. It just matters where they're coming from. Is it coming from volcanoes? Or is it coming from, for example, fires or car exhaust? Okay. So just like our carbon cycle or our carbon system, we have the climate system, okay? And we've been building up to this level, to this stage, by going through each of the spheres of our Earth, right? We've looked at the cryosphere, the atmosphere, a little bit about the biosphere because it's part of the carbon cycle, our oceans, our hydrosphere. Now, when we put all this information that we know, these relationships, these feedbacks, we can add them to our computers, our computer models to try to understand and forecast, predict what the future could look like. Now, obviously, some of these relationships are not simple to turn into mathematical equations because that's what has to happen. If you have ever done programming, if you're interested in computer modeling, a lot of what you're doing is you're taking some relationship between, for example, the amount of sea ice and temperature, and there's a relationship, for example, a trend line, the things that you've been doing in your Excel, you take that relationship and you put it into the computer program and it will do the math and give you results. But this is a very simple climate system. Our climate system in reality is very, very complex. And so as we move forward into an uncertain climate, how can we know what the future may bring? The way we can do that is to look at the past climate and see if our models can understand the past climate. If they're doing a good job of modeling and accurately predicting the past, or hindcasting is what it's called, the past, then we're pretty confident they're going to get the future right. So has the Earth's climate been different in the past? Well, yeah, I kind of hinted at that. What is the natural variability in our climate? What is the natural range in temperature? How hot has it been? How cold has it been? What is today compared to that past range? We kind of already know why the climate changes. I've given you some of that, but how can we use this information? Okay. How do we know the past has been different? Well, we have instrumental records. Okay, instruments being thermometers, satellites, modern technologies. Those only have existed since the mid 1800s to the late 1800s in terms of thermometers. Our satellites came about in, the 1960s and 70s. But the instrumental record, the thermometer record of Earth's temperature kind of started in the 1880s. And you looked at this data. It's what you were doing for your homework. So we can see the temperature anomaly with the baseline of 1951 through 1980. We can see that the 1951 through 1980 is right around zero. That makes sense because that's the mean, the average that we're comparing to. It should be around zero. Anything above zero means that year is warmer than that period of time. Anything below zero is cooler. And we can see that since 1980, every year has been warmer. We also have geologic records. So it's really, really cool about rocks is they're formed in certain places and they tell you about the climate when they formed. Okay, that's what I kind of tried to get at in the really brief geology class we had on Tuesday. Fossils are preserved in sedimentary rock. And if you find alligator fossils or crocodile fossils in Canada, that tells you that Canada must have been warmer in the past. We know how old the rock is. We can use the different radioactive isotopes that are on our planet to date that rock, and we can figure out how old that alligator would have been or that crocodile. So the geologic record, the rock record, can give us some information about our climate system, where and when things were different. So we can look at things like sand dunes or ancient sand dunes, dried lakes and rivers, and glacial valleys, to name just a few. Now this place is pretty cool. This is Yosemite Valley up north in California. How do you think Yosemite Valley was formed? Now, if you haven't been to Yosemite Valley, I highly recommend it. I'm going to let you know that I think they started implementing a timed entry, which is really critical for many reasons. But if you get there, it's amazing. Like these pictures do not do it justice. Like you walk in, you drive into this area and you just look up at these 2,000 to 3,000 foot rock cliffs on your side. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. How was it formed? It was formed by glaciers. Our slow moving rivers of ice carved out this channel. These are called U-shaped valleys. So big U shape with really steep sided canyons here. Well, if there were glaciers in California, it must have been colder. Yep, it was. Okay, if we look at the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, we can see, and this is all evidence, all these records have been compiled by looking at the rock records and other records. We can see the extent, how far these different glaciers expanded or existed in the past. The Laurentide ice sheet covered New York, all of New England, covered Ohio, Iowa, Montana, and not just a little bit of ice, it's like 2 miles thick of ice. And on the right here, 18,000 years ago, all of this area of the Sierra Nevada mountain was covered in glaciers. Not so much today. There's maybe a few left. Very sporadic, if any. So yeah. And our coastline was exposed by 120 meters, a drop in sea level, because we took all the water from the ocean, stored it on land as ice. So that's one way we can kind of reconstruct climate is by looking at our rocks, right? And you can take pieces all over the world and you can get a sense of the climate in all those places at different points in Earth's history. And the last type of climate record are called proxy records. Okay, and these are records that record or mimic climate. Things like flowers that leave pollen behind. A record of the pollen lets you know where these flowers existed. It doesn't give you the exact temperature or rainfall, but it lets you know that the climate was suitable for that flower at that time. Tree rings tell us about how wet or dry, maybe even how warm or cool it was, but don't quantify an exact rainfall or temperature either. But you take a lot of tree ring samples from around the world, you can reconstruct climate, hots and colds and wets and dries. And ice cores, which are my favorite, are samples from our glaciers. And we'll talk about why they are so unique. But they trap and are an archive of the ancient atmosphere. Okay. So let's pause here because we're going to talk a lot about proxy records for the rest of class. So let's go ahead and take a break. Let's take a 15-minute break and meet back at 2:33. 2:33. Is that right? Yeah, 2:33. And we'll continue on with proxies. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to continue talking about proxy records. I was like, deforestation? Okay, cool. Past climate are proxy records. Okay, so let's take a moment and think about the proxy record with tree rings. Okay, so tree rings, you can take them from living trees. You can also take samples from dead trees or trees that had recently died. And what's really great about these layered records, right? A layered record is this living object, like this tree, is preserving a record every season or every year. And then we can go back and look at those and interpret different climate information from it. So, for example, here's a bristlecone pine. This is up in the White Mountains in California. And these are the oldest known living trees on Earth, almost 5,000 years old. Now, if you took a tree ring sample from a tree, let's just say even locally, and you found a very thin ring one of the years in the tree ring sample, what is the most likely, or what would you conclude is the most likely information about conditions that year? Okay, right. So hot and dry, right? So maybe these more extremes, right? Like a tree, a plant, they're going to want moisture and moderate temperatures, cool temperatures, maybe not too hot, right? So the tree ring record doesn't give us a quantitative value. It doesn't say it was 95 degrees that year and 3 inches of rain fell, right? You can't get that information, but it gives you a qualitative record of local precipitation and temperature so that you can reconstruct, localized, regional hemispheric, eventually global time periods of these qualitative records. Okay, so there is an extensive database of tree rings, and many people have dedicated their lives to reconstructing climate through analyzing tree rings. It's a really remarkable record, and these are a proxy record, right? They're not telling us the exact values, but it can help us understand the past. Okay, so for example, trees, they start out growing, and each year they add onto their bark, onto their trunk. And you can see, for example, a rainy season may show up as a really thick line, or a dry season may show up as a thin line. And it could also be hot season or cool season. And for example, a scar from a forest fire. So some folks look at fire activity by looking at fire scars on trees. Again, doesn't tell you how big the fire was, just tells you that there was a fire in that area around that time. And each year you can go back and calculate the age of the tree. Some other proxy records that are layered are things like lake and ocean sediment. So we talked about in our lecture in the carbon cycle on Tuesday that all the living stuff in the ocean, when it dies or even when it just poops, it leaves records. All that stuff settles to the bottom of the ocean floor, and it's going to get layered. And that happens in lakes and our ocean, and you can drill deep down into the lake and into the ocean and pull up these sediment cores. And you can look at those through time, see different interesting things. Cave speleothems, which is what I had you listen to, and hopefully you got to at least finish or get close to finishing that episode, where Dr. Kathleen Johnson, who is a professor in the Earth Science Department at UCI, talks about her work going into these caves and various super cool places to try to understand climate and regional climate. There's also corals, which is another really cool living creature. They are living things, and they grow a layer every year, and you can go into the oceans and drill into them, take samples without harming them, and look at those. So we'll talk about those. And then also ice cores, which is what I do. Okay, so in order to understand a little bit about how we can get climate records from these other layer records, we have to go back and think about isotopes. Okay, so we talked a little bit about isotopes when we talked about radiocarbon and carbon dating. Other isotopes that exist naturally on our planet are oxygen isotopes. Okay, so remember, oxygen or isotopes, same number of protons, a different number of neutrons. When you add the protons and neutrons up, that gives you the atomic mass. So most of the oxygen in our atmosphere, in our environment, is oxygen 16, meaning it has 8 protons, 8 neutrons. There's also some oxygen 17s, and then there's oxygen 18s. So there's 10 neutrons. There's quite a bit more oxygen 18 than there is 17. So it's comparing oxygen 16 and 18 can give us some idea of natural processes, because plants, animals, evaporation, for example, are going to prefer one of these isotopes over the other. Okay, let's think about that. Here are my two the most common isotopes of oxygen: 16, oxygen 18. Which of the molecules is heavier? Oxygen 18, oxygen 16. So, sorry, oxygen 16 is A, oxygen 18 is B. All right. So oxygen 18 is slightly heavier because it has 2 extra neutrons. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's a little bit heavier. Now, which one? We have water, H2O. water is H2O. Which molecule of water vapor would be more likely to evaporate from the ocean? Water vapor that has oxygen 16 in it or water vapor that has oxygen 18 in it? Okay, yes. The lighter isotope would be more readily evaporated because it's lighter. That process of evaporation is going to prefer the lighter isotope of oxygen. Okay, so what happens is over time, depending upon the climate and the temperature, we're going to get a separation of the oxygen isotopes in the Earth system. Okay, so as we have evaporation occurring in our ocean, the lighter oxygen isotope will evaporate more easily, leaving more of the heavy oxygen 18 behind in our oceans. Now, that oxygen 16 in the water vapor can condense and form clouds, and it could get moved towards the poles, away from the ocean. And it can fall as precipitation, either as rain or, at the poles, it's probably snow. And the snow is going to have a lot of oxygen 16 in it because oxygen 18 will fall out along the way through evaporation or other rain. So what we end up doing is, especially during really cold periods where we're building up a lot of ice on land, the ice on land is going to have a heck of a lot of 16 oxygen, or a hella a lot of 16 oxygen. And the ocean is going to have much more oxygen 18. Now, during warm periods where we're not building up as much ice, that oxygen 16 will make its way back to the ocean. And so when we compare, we take samples of sediment cores and corals and all these things, they will preserve some of that signature, the ratio of oxygen 16 to 18. Okay, so let's think about it again. During a glacial period, what's going to happen to the water in the ocean? Is it going to be enriched in 16 oxygen or oxygen 16, meaning more oxygen 16? Is it going to be enriched in oxygen 18, or will it have equal amounts? During a glacial period, which means it's cooler, it's colder on our planet. All right. So during the glacial period, the water in the oceans will have more oxygen 18. And I don't know why I keep writing it like that. Oxygen 18. Because the lighter isotope, the 16, will be evaporated and get locked up in the ice, making the ratio, the relative abundance in the oceans more weighted towards the oxygen 18. Now, there will never be equal amounts of oxygen 18 and 16 because they don't even exist in nature like that. It's only a few percentage of oxygens that are oxygen 18. So we're talking about small changes, but those changes really can tell us about climate. Now, there's carbon in the oceans. There's oxygen, or excuse me, there's carbon dioxide in the oceans, CO2. So during a glacial period, the carbon dioxide in the ocean is going to be enriched in 16 oxygen, enriched in 18. And I already told you that, see, this is not even real. All right. So during a glacial period, all the critters living around in the ocean, they're going to be taking up CO2. There's going to be respiration and everything. And the CO2 that results will have a signature of the oxygen in the ocean. So it will also be enriched. Okay. And so the CO2 that the phytoplankton are using and the carbon that's getting stored deep down in the ocean floor, on the ocean floor, will be enriched in oxygen 18. That's the point I'm trying to drive here. Oops. So it looks something like this. During a non-glacial period, a warm period, the water in the ocean contains both oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, not at equal amounts though, because that's just not how they naturally occur, but they're not as skewed. During glacial period, more of the oxygen 16, that isotopically light oxygen, gets locked away on land, and our seawater becomes enriched in the isotopically heavy oxygen 18, which means all of the processes that happen in the ocean will be skewed, will have that signature of heavier oxygen. Okay. Now again, that's oxygen isotopes. We talked a little bit about carbon isotopes. The two naturally occurring non-radioactive carbons are carbon-12 and carbon-13. Again, here's their proportions. Only about 1% of carbon is 13. 99% is carbon-12. Which molecule is heavier? Carbon-13. Now, which molecule is more likely to be taken up during photosynthesis? Would it be 13 CO2 or is it going to be 12 CO2? You can just type 13 or 12. Which one are plants going to want to take up? 13 CO2 or 12 CO2? Yeah, it's lighter, okay? It's easier to take it in, it's easier to digest it, do all this, the chemical reactions, okay? So this leads to a record in plant tissue, okay? And so, whoops, when we look at some of the values, and you don't have to know any of these, but the importance here is that carbon isotopes can inform us about carbon cycling, right? So different plants are going to take up 12 CO2 versus 13 CO2, and you start to create this separation or this enrichment or depletion. And so we can actually use that knowledge that plants are going to take up the 12 CO2, and when fires happen, that type of CO2 gets emitted, et cetera. We can use that information to reconstruct our carbon cycle through time. So we have oxygen can tell us about temperature, how much land ice there was, and carbon can tell us about the cycling of carbon through time. Okay, so sediment cores. This is what a sediment core looks like. Some of them look like. You drill down into the ocean or into the lake and you pull up layered sediment. Okay, and scientists will look at all those layers. You can look at what it's made up. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it limestone? That'll tell you a little bit about the history. We can use different isotopes, radioactive isotopes, to date that sediment. I have a little video here showing you what that research looks like.
Okay guys, ready?
When you're sitting out on a ship in the middle of the ocean, you always feel truly small. I don't care how big your boat is. When you're in the middle of the ocean, you know, you're in the middle of the ocean.
Ah, it's amazing. It's nothing like going to sea.
And then on the JR, you anchor yourself to the bottom of the ocean. And for anyone who's actually been in a boat, this is a crazy idea because you're anchored to the bottom of the ocean by kilometers of pipe into a deep hole. And no matter how much you knew in advance, the reason why you're drilling there is because you don't know enough about it already.
That's one of the most exciting things about scientific ocean drilling, is that these sediments have been under the seabed for sometimes millions of years, and then they get brought up and they're revealed to people for the first time.
The amazing thing about sediments is that sediments really tell the natural history of what's happened in the past. And so a true sedimentologist can look at the sediment, like look at the grains, and then of course look at what's inside of them, and then tell a story about an environment without any fancy techniques at all. They can tell you the history of what's happened there. So that's what's amazing about sedimentology.
The sedimentology team is the first line of observation, and they're looking at color, grain size. If the particles are big enough to see with the hand lens or the naked eye, you can get at what they're made out of, their composition. Check this out. So you come up out of this lighter colored sediment, and the degree of bioturbation or burrowing goes down, and you get to this really dark layer, and it looks like it's
disappeared. So it indicates the...
Essentially, you're expected to look at every inch of sediment that comes up on board the JR and then describe the basic composition. So is it comprised mostly of lithic particles from rocks? Is it comprised of living organisms that are either made out of carbonate or made out of silica? And then, of course, as a scientist, you have to record all of these observations in great detail.
Another one or two people on the team take some of that sediment, put it on a smear slide, and look at it under a microscope and characterize whether the material's microfossils. If so, what kind are they? What do they look like? What's their size? That helps the paleontology team then to identify those species.
And then you take really fine scale, line scale scans. And that's because the sediments, as they're exposed to oxygen, change color. So you essentially have the first and only pristine look at these colors, and then you take a picture really fast so you can preserve it.
I think it would be better.
The fact that the sedimentology team is one of the bigger teams is to help really enhance that. This is the first description and the description of the core that's in the site reports forever. And that's recorded for the community, for scientists 100, 500 years from now. It's basically like an archive for us, scientists and humanity, and so that description the sedimentology team does is important and should last forever.
It really is the best position to be on for understanding any given cruise. You are going to know more about the cores than anyone else on board that ship, and if you use the position and do what a good sedimentologist should be doing, so really observe and really talk to people and discuss the science, you're going to walk off with an incredible amount of knowledge about whatever exciting time period you're studying. So have fun.
All right, so sediment cores, there's massive amounts of sediment cores in storage and in repositories in the US, around the world. Our knowledge of changes in the ocean are found in that sediment, right? We can take samples of those little phytoplankton fossils, study the carbon that made them up to understand carbon and oxygen, to understand changes in the climate and in the carbon cycling through time. So pretty cool. So some of the stuff we can get from sediment cores are temperature, right? We can look at the oxygen isotopes and reconstruct temperature many, many million years ago. So as mentioned, sediment cores go back millions of years. And so we can look at, so this is age going from 0 to 8 million years ago, and we can see that temperature was getting warmer. Okay, other things we can obtain from the sediment cores are things like volcanic activity, right? So big volcanic eruptions, that ash will fall on the ocean. Okay, the Earth is 70% water. That ash will eventually fall and trickle down, settle down to the bottom, and be preserved forever in the sediment. So you can see this tephra layer from a volcanic eruption. Other things we can see, climate records, are fires, right? So I mentioned, stuff that burns can leave charcoal behind, and you can see different layers of charcoal here. This gives you a sense of fire activity, how frequent fires happen through time. Doesn't really give you a sense of how much stuff was burned, but it does give you a sense of how frequent fires were in that region. Okay, so we have speleothems. So that's our next layered record. So speleothems are formed as water is trickling down through the karst landscape. So karst is landscape that is made up of mainly limestone, calcium carbonate rock. And as the water is trickling down through, water absorbs carbon dioxide, creates a weak acid, that carbonic acid, and can start to dissolve through that rock. You get these caves. The relationship between the amount of carbon and oxygen in the air in the cave allows for these speleothems to grow. Okay, so you get CO2 degassing and you precipitate out calcite. Drip, 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 drip. Slowly, these speleothems grow. And you can take measurements of all different types of ions and minerals and the relationship between different minerals to get a sense of some of these cycles and these processes. Okay, so what information can we learn about speleothems? Well, first let's watch the video so we can understand a little bit more about how speleothems grow.
If you're a college student, keep watching.
No. Here we go.
In the land of hobbits and wizards, deep within a mountainside lies a secret history, waiting to be discovered. Scientists and cavers squeeze, crawl, and rappel into the darkness, illuminated only by head torch. At the end of their journey awaits weird growth formations called speleotherms. Speleotherms are commonly called stalagmites or stalactites, and they are drip formations made from minerals precipitated out of the water. Now these minerals have come from the atmosphere above. They travel through the water channels and drip down from the ceiling of the cave and form these growths. Speleotherms take a long time to grow, tens of thousands of years. And as they grow, they create a picture of the outside conditions through the minerals that drip down. Scientists who have journeyed from far and wide come to take core samples from these speleotherms and look at the amazing records they capture. They use specialized drill to draw out long, thin cylinder samples that can be taken back to the lab and analyzed. In 2020, a group of scientists published a paper where they had done just that. They separated the core into segments and dissolved them. Then they used a mass spectrometer to separate and measure all of the components and calculate the amount and state of thorium and uranium. This can be used to date the segments and reconstruct a timeline of growth. As with all of these things, they also cross-reference their findings with other past climate reconstructions, such as ice cores and preserved pollen samples. Their data showed that when it was warmer, there was more speleotherm growth, and when it was cooler, there was less. This meant that speleotherms that were lower in altitude were able to grow for longer periods, whereas the ones at higher altitude only grew for short, warmer periods. This also reflects the vegetation growth on the soil above, showing that the forest was moving up and down the mountainside with the change in temperature. Our Earth goes through cycles of warming and cooling. There are three main things that control these cycles: the rotation around the sun, the tilt of our axle, and the precession or circulation of the axle. Combined, they are called the Milankovitch cycles. The Milankovitch cycles create periods of glaciation and interglaciation.
Okay, so speleothems, we can learn things like precipitation or water cycling, right? The monsoon. So as Dr. Johnson talked about in the podcast episode, that's what one of her group's main research projects is looking at, is understanding precipitation and monsoon cycling in Eastern Asia. We can look at temperature, carbon cycling, trace nutrients. And so here's a speleothem cut open, and you can see all of those beautiful annual, subannual layers, which is super cool. Okay, corals. Okay, another living organism that creates a natural layered effect. And corals are living in the ocean. So they're going to be sensitive to changes in ocean temperature, ocean pH, ocean salinity, nutrients, and we can get a lot of information from these corals. Okay, so here's another video about what corals can tell us about climate.
When you look at the ocean, it really looks all the same as far as the eye can see in many ways. One of the jokes my children have is I took them, one of their first boat trips was off the coast of Florida, and I said, well, maybe we'll hit the Gulf Stream. And about every 10 minutes they kept saying, are we in the Gulf Stream yet? And you can't ever tell when you're in the Gulf Stream unless you're making an enormous number of measurements, because you don't see it. There's so much happening that the eye cannot see. I'm a paleoceanographer who looks at biological fossils back through time to understand how the ocean has changed over the last 500 to 1,000 years. The first question we ask is, what information do we want to know about the Earth, and where can we go on the planet to best answer those questions? Once you've sort of identified that location, we go out, we look for the largest coral that we can find. Corals grow in these large formations, and they're building skeleton as they grow. And as they secrete their skeletons, they will take in chemicals from the seawater based on the conditions they're growing in. So as the temperature changes, they're going to have a different chemical composition. As the salinity changes, they're going to have a different chemical composition. As surface currents change, they're going to reflect those changes in their skeleton as well. The corals that we're interested in grow into really, really large boulders that can live for 500 or 600 years. And then we go ahead and we'll drill a core out from the center of that colony. It doesn't kill the colony continues to thrive for decades afterwards. But it gives us a little bit of a piece from the inside of that colony that extends back through time. Once you have the samples in the lab, we look at certain trace elements like strontium and barium that can tell us about what's been happening in that coral. And so we can reconstruct those environmental conditions over the past several hundred years. And looking back in time and understanding how this system works is very critical to understanding how climate will change in the future. Our technologies change dramatically in a 10 to 15 year time period. And so the type of analysis that we're able to do on these samples 15 years from now is very different than the analysis we're able to do now. And being at a place that is collecting and preserving such an enormous amount of the Earth's history through sample collection, and to be working on not just trying to collect new data all the time, but trying to go back and look at what else can we learn that we didn't know we could learn 20 years ago. That's what really excited me about coming to the American Museum of Natural History.
All right, so corals, cool, lots of things can learn about. Precipitation and rainfall, right? Because precipitation and rainfall are going to impact salinity, temperature, water conditions, nutrients, cyclical events like ENSO, right? Because we know ENSO impacts temperature, impacts nutrient availability, impacts all types of fun stuff. So all this information we can acquire from sampling coral, and we can acquire that back in time before we had instrumental records. All right. So the last proxy record is ice cores. Okay, it's not the last one there is, but it's the last one we're going to talk about. And ice cores are cylinders of ice that we drill from our ice sheets and glaciers. And here is a beautiful ice core that was drilled from the West Antarctic ice sheet, also known as Waste Divide, back in 2010, something like that. And ice cores can give us a snapshot of the past climate. And what's different about ice cores compared to other proxy records is that ice cores contain samples of the ancient atmosphere. We don't have to infer anything. We can actually take the air out of those samples and measure it for the amount of carbon dioxide or methane or other gases. Oldest ice cores we have right now date back to about 800,000 years. So they're not nearly as old as, say, the sediment cores, There's a current project in Antarctica right now looking for ice that's about 2 million years old. And they've successfully found it. Now they're just going to go back and drill it in order to preserve the air inside. Okay, so, whoops. Let me see. Is this the video I want? Okay, yeah. So, this is a video of me back when I was a postdoc at UCI. So I finished my PhD and I stayed on for several months finishing up some analysis. And UCI had this big fundraising campaign called Brilliant Future. I'm sure you've seen the signs everywhere. They're probably still up on campus. And they made this video of me in the lab doing some of this ice core analysis. So we'll watch this video and then talk a little bit more about some of the ice core work and what we can learn from ice cores.
The feeling of holding an ice core that is 50,000 years old is pretty surreal. It makes me realize just how small humans are in the grand scheme of the Earth's age and what's happening. My name is Melinda Neiswanger. I am a first-generation college student, and I love ice core research because it's cool, and the pun is intended there. My research involves using ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica to understand how fires have changed in the past. Understanding the past climate is important for us in terms of understanding what could happen in the future, as well as understanding just how much humans are changing the climate now from its natural background levels. Ice cores hold a lot of information about the Earth's climate. You have the ice itself, and then you also have the air bubbles that are trapped inside. So within the air bubbles, you can see whatever was in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. Within the ice itself, you can see things like volcanic ash layers, bacteria, and the temperature of the planet as well. My role when I went to Antarctica was to help drill an ice core called the South Pole Ice Core. Depending on the ice core site, we can drill anywhere from maybe 5,000 feet to over 2 miles in depth. The ice travels about 11,000 miles from Antarctica back to UC Irvine, where we can analyze the ice cores. Here at our lab, we're specifically interested in trace gases, which are gases that are found in very small amounts in the atmosphere. And these gases can tell us a lot about different climate phenomenon, like wildfires or how the ocean circulates. I just think it's phenomenal that we can look back in time by using ice and seeing what's going on our planet and really trying to make projections about how our climate may change in the future so that we can be better prepared.
Okay, well, that's my 2 minutes of fame. So what can we learn from ice cores? We can learn about the composition of the atmosphere, right? As I mentioned in the video, those air bubbles that you're looking at in this picture are little bubbles of ancient air. What was in the air when that bubble got locked in that ice? We can look at atmospheric particles, right? Wildfires, soot from human pollution, all types of jazz. Also air temperature because of the oxygen isotopes, right? The water vapor or the ice, H2O, frozen water, will preserve the oxygen ratio between the oxygen 16, oxygen 18 ratio. I want to emphasize, because this is super important, super amazing, is that ice cores are the only archive of the past atmospheric composition we have. They are telling us there are little jars, basically, of ancient air. Sediment cores, other things, they're not giving us archives. We have to infer a few things before we can get information. This is the air. We're measuring the air from 800,000 years ago. Okay, so how exactly does the air get trapped? Well, unlike ice that forms in your freezer, where you're changing the temperature of water to ice, right? You're taking liquid water, putting it in a cold freezer, forming ice that way. The way ice is forming in the polar regions is through the compression of snow year after year, not a temperature change. So the snow falls over Antarctica and it doesn't melt. The next year the snow falls, the next year the snow falls, continuing. And over time, that snow compresses. And during that compression, the air bubbles start to get locked into the grains. They can't escape. And then eventually over time, there's enough pressure on top of that ice or that snow that it turns into what we call ice, and the air gets trapped indefinitely, and they age together. Okay? But until that ice forms, what we call glacial ice, the air can still kind of interact with the atmosphere. So my question for you, okay, here's some more pictures of the cool air bubbles inside the ice. What is going to be older? Is it going to be the ice surrounding the air bubbles, or is it going to be the air bubbles? All right. So we're not sure. Is it the ice or the air bubbles? Okay, let's go back. Now, what's landing is the snow. The snow falls from the sky. It's there. It takes several hundred, if not 1,000 years for that snow to compress. And during this period of time, which we call the firn layer, the unconsolidated snow, so it's not yet fully packed to ice, the air is actually interacting with the environment. And so what that means is that the ice that I'm holding here is about 200 to 2,000 years older than the air inside. So we account for this difference, we call it the delta age, with the fact that the ice, it fell as snow, then got compressed, and then the air got locked inside at a later date. So the air inside, those air bubbles, are always slightly younger than the snow, the ice around it. When we calculate that, we account for that when we do our analyses and our measurements. And the reason the range is so large is it just depends on how much snow is falling. So when it's really, really cold, there's not that much snow falling. So places in eastern Antarctica only see about 2 centimeters of snow per year. But that 2 centimeters of snow lasts forever in our time, right? And it will accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, but it takes a long time to accumulate enough pressure to turn to ice, that snow to ice, because it's not snowing as much. For example, in Western Antarctica, it snows 25 centimeters a year. So much more, it will turn to ice faster. And so that's why that age difference varies so much. Okay, so when we think about what makes up our atmosphere, what is some stuff, what are some measurements do you think we can make in air from the ice cores or also from the water, the ice of the ice cores? What are some things do you think that we can see in the ice? I already gave you some in the video. Freebies. Yeah, bacteria, soot. Bacteria, everyone always gets weirded out by that. They're like, oh my gosh, there's like ancient bacteria in the ice that you're bringing and you're melting and it's gonna like be the next pandemic. No, it's not. Okay. But what about what else? What else is in our atmosphere? We've talked about other things. What's an important one? We're talking about it a lot because of climate change. CO2, methane, particles, aerosols, things from volcanoes. We've talked about soot, wildfires, all types of fun stuff, okay? So anything that goes up in the air will fall out at some point, oftentimes over the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets. Ash and sulfur from volcanic eruptions, dust and sea salt can indicate how windy or dry the climate was, soot from forest fires, and over the last few thousand years, pollution. Not just carbon pollution, but things like lead pollution from the manufacturing of silver during the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We can actually look and see the pollution events from 2,000 years ago, from early human civilizations, Roman Empire, for example. Okay, so this is a record from the ice core. This is from Antarctica. This record is going back in time on the left. So on the left here is 800,000 years ago. As we move to the right, it's modern day, or 1950, which is our zero, year 1950. The top blue line is showing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, bubbles, over that 800,000 years. The black line is the oxygen isotopes, which allow us to infer temperature change. So temperature anomaly over Antarctica. So it's either warmer or colder. And the bottom is methane. The amount of methane in those air bubbles, again, from 800,000 years ago up until 1950. Now, based on the ice core record, whoops, I messed up. Based on the ice core record, when was the last glacial or cold period on our planet? All right. So cold period. If it's colder on our planet, there's going to be less CO2, less methane, because those are greenhouse gases. Okay? So when was the most recent time where there was less CO2? Well, it was right around here, around 20,000 years ago. We could also look at the Antarctic temperature. Around 20,000 years ago, Antarctica was about 10 degrees Celsius colder, and methane was also low. Say our greenhouse gases were low. Remember, that is a linear relationship, meaning when CO2 and methane, those greenhouse gases are low, temperatures are low. When they're high, temperatures are high. The greenhouse effect. Okay, so 20,000 years ago. Now, based on this record, whoa, what's happening? I don't have it. Here we go. I don't know. Ignore the title of the question. I don't know, it didn't get changed. But based on the ice core record, should we be heading into or out of an interglacial period? So right now we're in a warm period. Based on the timing you see in the record from the previous changes, should we be going into heading into this warm period or heading out of it? Alrighty, so let's look at this record in more detail. Here we are today. Whoops. Here we are today. Let me choose a color that is good for all of these. Maybe this blue. Okay. Here we are today with CO2, oxygen isotopes, and methane. Now, if we go back in time, we see that CO2 stays high for a little bit of time. So does methane. They all stay high for a little bit of time, but then quickly start to descend back into a cold period. We see that this change, this gradual decrease in greenhouse effect, greenhouse gases, back into a cold period. And so with that, if we were to forecast or predict based on this record alone, knowing nothing about human activity and the changes we've made, you would think we're going to go back down, right? Kind of on that same trajectory, which would mean we'd be heading out of or moving into a glacial period. Based on this data alone, the Earth is slowly, or wanted to, go into a glacial period. But of course, human activity has now changed this system a lot. Another thing I'd like to point out here is the timing of these events. If we look at the timing of these events, let me just point out a few here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cycles. There's 8 times in the last 800,000 years where CO2 was high and then it dropped back down. Let me think about this. 800,000 years divided by 8. What happens every roughly 100,000 years? Yeah, Milankovitch cycles. The changes in Earth's orbit, our tilt, and the precession align every 100,000 years. So the CO2, the ice core record confirmed the idea that changes in our orbit impact climate. Okay, now it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, though. We're still trying to figure out is what comes first? Is it the CO2 drops, which then causes climate, or in the orbit, or whatever? All we know is they align. Okay, and so this record here is the proof that before humans came around, CO2 and methane, they were on this cycle. Now, this is the maximum CO2 we see in the record. Sorry, my drawing is all wild now. The maximum CO2 we saw was about 300 parts per million. Today, we are at 420. And so in this week's lab, you're going to be looking at the ice core CO2 record along with the modern Mauna Loa CO2 record, and you're going to see when you plot them together, the increase is unbelievable. It's just like a vertical line. Okay, so other climate records from ice cores that we can look at. Sorry, I'm going to pause really quick here to do something on my end. I have to unhide a slide for you. Oops, I wanted to unhide all of those. Unhide. We have many different things we measure. So at the lab at UCI, if you're ever curious, you can ask one of the graduate students to give you a lab tour. They're always happy to do that. You can say that I sent you. They're going to love me. But they're always very happy to show you the ice, let you see it, because it's important to understand, that science, how we're understanding our climate is changing. Lots of things. We look at ash, we look at biology, chemistry, isotopes, etc. There's so much research going on. At the UCI laboratory, we're really only looking at gases and some of the dissolved chemicals in the water when you melt the ice. Okay, so when you collect ice cores, like where do you go, right? Obviously, you're going to go to Antarctica and Greenland if you want the longer term records, because those ice sheets have been on the planet. They've been staying around. They've been cold for hundreds of thousands of years, even a few million years. We drill into the ice sheet using specialized equipment, and then we bring those ice core samples back. So the video I showed kind of gives you a really brief synopsis of that. UCI was heavily involved in a recent ice core campaign to Antarctica, to the South Pole, which drilled down to 1,751 meters and brought back about 54,000 years of climate records. And one of the reasons we drilled at South Pole versus somewhere else is we were looking for really, really cold ice. So just like we talked about how permafrost is impacted by the geothermal flux of the earth, can thaw the permafrost from depth, the ice can start to get warm from the geothermal heat. So you want to drill in a place that's not a problem. And so we drilled at South Pole because it's so cold there. It keeps the ice sheet super cold even as you get closer to the bedrock. Okay, so here I am. I spent about 14 weeks, my first trip down to Antarctica. So I flew the first week, second week of November, spent Thanksgiving, Christmas, my birthday, New Year's, came back mid-February. So I didn't have winter. I escaped winter, spent 24-hour days in Antarctica. I was responsible for measuring the core, packaging it up, keeping track of all that information so that we could bring it back to the laboratory and know the depth so we could know how old the ice was for our analysis. I got this question a lot. What's it like to go to Antarctica? Well, it's a trek, okay? You don't just get there in a day. I flew from LAX down to Sydney, nonstop, 14-hour flight. Then I had a layover, about 8-hour layover in Sydney until I got to Christchurch, New Zealand. That's about a 3.5-hour flight. From Christchurch, New Zealand, I moved over from commercial aircraft to Air Force military planes. So the US Air Force flies the US Antarctic program through and around Antarctica. So I flew on a C-17. I flew on a C-17 military plane from Christchurch down to McMurdo. That was about a 5-hour flight. We land on the ice. And then from McMurdo, I flew to South Pole, another 3-hour flight. So it took about 5 days. Okay, so think about jet lag. That is real. If you have severe jet lag, it feels like the flu. It was not good. Okay, so when you get to Antarctica, you got to get all geared up. You can't just go willy-nilly. You got to have the right gear, so they provide that for you. So that's my Canada Down jacket. So I know Canada Down is kind of fashionable lately. Reference, these big parkas are pushing $2,000 each. You don't get to keep these. These are just temporary for you to use during your time on the ice. Lots of fun stuff. And here we are headed to Antarctica. As I said, I flew on the C-17. A fun fact is on the first flight down, they send dynamite, TNT dynamite, down to Antarctica to help deal with the crevasses that form. So glaciers are moving and they can split open. You get these big divots. It can be dangerous to people trying to move around. So they'll actually blow those up. And so they cave in on themselves. And anyway, so they loaded our airplane with dynamite right at the end, with the idea that if something happened, they would just open the back of the plane and push out the dynamite into the ocean, which thankfully that did not happen. Anyway, that's all I have for you today on our proxies. This week's homework is going to be looking at those CO2 records, comparing them and thinking about rates of change and how CO2 has changed over your lifetime. And then until next week, we're going to get into climate change, what we know, what could happen, and then our solutions and your guys' projects. So that's it. Hope you have a great weekend. Don't forget, check-in, quizzes, homework, same old stuff. But I'll see you on Tuesday.